Hey everyone, welcome back, or just welcome if this is your first time being here. I'm Vince. This is something I like to call books you should know about. Before I get started, I want to remind you just how helpful it is when you hit the like button. So if you like this video and you'd like to see more of them, please let me know by hitting the like button. All right, today we are looking at a book called Black Theology and Black Power by James Cone. I divide this video into 4 short sections that I think will give you a good understanding of what Cone is saying. In the first, we're going to talk about how black theology is different from other theologies, like why specifically have a black theology. The second is going to talk about the term black power and what Cone means by that. Then we're going to look at black theology and figure out what exactly Cone means by that. And then at the end, I'll just give a brief recounting of what some of the things that Cone says that he thinks needs to happen for us to move forward, as a country on this issue. James Cone was really the father of black theology. Even saying that, brings up that question, though. You go, what exactly is black theology? I remember when I first heard that term 20 years ago, and I had that thought, isn't theology the same for everyone? Well, if you have the same question, I have a terrific answer. This is the place to start. I'm glad you're here. James Cone is not talking about black people per se. By the way, that is his terminology. He uses black, blacks, white, whites. So instead of something else like African American or Anglo. And so I'm going to use that same terminology. He's not talking about black people per se. He's talking about oppressed people. That being said, there's no doubt that at the time that he wrote this book, black people were the oppressed people in America. This is probably true even today, but we might start including things like other minorities. You can certainly think in terms of patriarchy, right? I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that one. Women were and probably still are treated like second-class citizens in a lot of cases. The things we generally think of as woman, like caring for others, being supportive, being a mom, all those things are seen as inferior to the things we generally consider as man or masculine. And it's hard for men to see that that's a bad thing. Especially in the past, men thought they were doing women a favor by forcing them to stay home and take care of children. Let the women be women and do what they're supposed to do. So when he says black, you can also think of female if you want to, or you can just simply think oppressed. However, that being said, James Cone is a black man talking about black people. And like I said, there is no doubt that they were and are in this kind of position. There's no doubt that while you can think of oppressed in general, he means black in specific. He's talking about oppressed people, but he's talking very specifically about black also, because that's what he's fighting against. So what is black theology, or oppressed theology, you might say? It's looking at God from the viewpoint of the oppressed, because we're so used to looking at God from the viewpoint of the majority or the viewpoint of the oppressor. So much theology is done by white people, right? And so he's saying we need to look at things from the viewpoint of the oppressed. Okay, so that's the first section. Now we're going to talk about black power. What is that? Well, I thought a good idea would be to start off with an example of a story I think we could use. I was pretty much raised around white people. I was pretty sheltered. I started teaching, and this changed. One year I taught at an inner city school, and it was primarily black. This is probably I was in my mid-20s. And I asked a black friend of mine, a teacher friend of mine, I said, hey, what is it? What's the difference? Why do people say black culture and white culture? How do we see things differently? He said it came down to commotion. Now, whatever you think, you probably might have a different answer for that, but that's what he said. He said it comes down to commotion. He said white people don't like commotion or noise. Black people like it, and in fact, they do better in it. After we talked about, so he gave me a couple different examples and everything, but I started noticing all the cars that would pull up with black kids in them, they would have their music on really loud, bass thumping and everything, and all the white teachers are going, oh, I can't believe that a parent is doing that, but then the white kids, they did not show up in cars like that, and the music was not very loud. And I started thinking about this. I did experiment. I just started playing music during my class as my kids were doing their work. And man, they started doing their work so much better. They started, they just started working with each other. They started asking questions. I remember one time I asked this one little girl and I said, I don't know what you're saying to me. I can't understand it, but it sounds like it's right. And it was. She went and taught the rest of the class. I mean, it was terrific. Grades went up. Concentration went up. It was astounding to me. I couldn't understand it. Now, I don't want to be accused of minimizing the black and white racial issue, having to just do with music. Also, I'm not trying to characterize all whites or blacks. If you are a white person who loves commotion and loud music, or you're a black person who does not, good for you. But I think that at least this helps us to understand this issue. So, by the way, there's a great book. If you're a teacher, there's a great book that I probably should do sometime on this channel, because it's definitely a book you should know about if you're a teacher, that talks about this white culture trying to teach black students, and it's called Other People's Children. One of the things that this book does that's really going to help us with our investigation today is that it says, in a dominant culture where the majority has set up these rules, the rules follow the dominant culture, and so the subculture has a hard time investing in those rules or getting used to those rules. For instance, we don't allow loud music to be played in the classroom, and we certainly don't allow it during state testing, even though it would probably help a lot of our minority students be successful. White culture has made these rules to suit white culture and just assumed that it fit everybody. And we can call that white power. Just as like when he wrote the book, Black Power was hard to understand. It was a term hard to understand. It's kind of a hard term to understand today. And one of the reasons why is because when you're in the majority, you have a hard time seeing your own power. This is why some white people say, well, I don't have white power. Well, yeah, you really do. You exert whiteness onto everybody else. It's just that it's harder to see. Again, go back to my music analogy, because as a white person, my initial reaction to a classroom, if a teacher says I want to play music, I'd say no. You have to. I understand some students learn better with it, but you have to keep in mind the interests of all your students. Well, yeah, but I was teaching in a primarily black classroom, but still I was just thinking, yeah, but it's also better for all students. Okay, and that's just not true. So black power to Cone is not blacks desiring to be more powerful than whites, but just as powerful. So to be on equal footing. And again, if you want to think of it this way, you could say oppressed power. Like the oppressed power is to be on equal footing with the oppressor. And what the oppressor power does a lot of times is to say, well, that's racist then, but he'd say, no, racism is one race trying to exert its dominance over another. Blacks are not trying to assert dominance, only equality. For a white person who's used to being in the authority, equality could look like racism, like if I have, now I'm not used to giving other people authority. I'm not used to having to take their culture in mind. And so a raising up of another culture looks in my eyes like a lowering down of my own culture. Cone says, integration as commonly understood is nothing but a subterfuge for white supremacy, as always involving only a token number of Negroes integrated into white institutions on the white man's terms. Black power, then, must say no to whites who invite them to share in their inhumanity toward black people. So what he's saying is, if you think of this in terms of the American school, we open our doors and we say, oh, we're integrated now. We welcome black boys and girls to come into our white schools. Well, first off, you're doing it on white terms. Like no white person said, oh, I get to go to the black school. Right? They don't want to do that because they know that our rules are set up in such a way that black schools are not nearly as good as white schools. But even after that, we are allowing black students to come in and learn like white students, right? And so if you think of like the music example, you can come into our schools as long as you don't bring that music with you. Let me stop real quick and talk about violence, because whenever you talk about black power, that topic always comes up. What does Cone say about violence committed in the name of black power? And to Cone, this is another question that's easy for the unoppressed to sit around and talk about it. Because what the answer is, and a lot of times the unoppressed don't see it, is that there's already violence. And that violence is being perpetrated against the second-class citizen or the minority. And the first-class citizen, or the one who makes the rules, often doesn't see that there's violence actually happening. Cone says, it is a fact that most whites seem to overlook the fact that violence already exists. The Christian does not decide between violence and nonviolence, evil and good. He decides between the less and the greater evil. So when it comes down to violence, we choose which violence is more acceptable. On this note of violence, by the way, he points out the irony that white Christians are against black violence when they insist on equal rights, but they're all for it when police are using violence to put down riots, or we're using violence in war to further democracy. So there's an irony he points out. I hope you're getting a sense that at the heart of this book, at the heart of Black Power, at the heart of reconciliation is the dignity of the black person. The black person learning to be his or herself and asserting their equality. Okay, so where does God fit in? So far, I haven't said anything about God. We've talked about Black Power, but where does the Black theology fit in? To Cone, God is at the root of Black Power. God empowers blacks to know themselves and give themselves power and assert themselves, right? Like, so that's what Cone says the black people need to do is to realize who they are, that they are human beings and they are equal to whites. God gives them the power to do that. Cone says, is this not why God became man in Jesus Christ, so that man might become what he is? Is not this at least a part of what St. Paul had in mind when he said, for freedom Christ has set us free? As long as man is a slave to another power, he is not free to serve God with mature responsibility. He is not free to become what he is, human. And how does the black person do this? By becoming black. Not by pretending they're white, but by recognizing their blackness and taking hold of that. Cone famously here says, Jesus was black. What does he mean by that? Because that upset an awful lot of people. Remember, when he says black, he's using it as a metaphor for all oppressed. Jesus was not in the dominant class. He was not, he was a Jew. He was under Roman rule, and he was born in a stable. He became one of the oppressed. And that might not mean very much to us to think Jewish Romans. In fact, whenever we think stable, we just think of the Christmas story, and we kind of get rid of anything oppressive about that. So we might read about this stuff in history books, and we kind of get this fuzzy knowledge of it. But when we look at it with the way that Cone says it, like if Jesus were born today, he would be born as a black baby in a ghetto. Cone says, thinking of Christ as non-black in the 20th century is as theologically impossible as thinking of him as a non-Jew or as non-Jewish in the first century. And if you find that a little off-putting, you're starting to get it. It's supposed to be off-putting. Like Jesus being a Jew, dying on a Jewish cross, being spit on by Jewish soldiers, being laughed at, that's supposed to be offensive to us, to hear about that. And we somehow lose that. But Jesus was one of the oppressed. Cone says, where there is black, there is oppression. But blacks can be assured that where there is blackness, there is Christ, who has taken on blackness, so that what is evil in men's eyes might become good. Therefore, Christ is black because he is oppressed, and oppressed because he is black. And if the church is to join Christ by following his opening, it too must go where suffering is and become black also. And so that leads us into our final section, which is just, what does it take for reconciliation to happen? How do we move forward? Cone says the church needs to accept Christ's blackness and become black with him. What that means is that for black people, they need to realize the blackness inside of them. They need to realize that they are equals, and they need to assert themselves as such. But for white people, they also need to realize the blackness of Christ, and just as Christ, they need to start being on the side of blackness. And that's something that the white church has definitely failed to do for an awful, awful long time now, is to be on the side of the minority. All right, there you have it. That was Black Theology and Black Power. It's a difficult book, especially if you're in the majority. It's a very direct book, and it's certainly a book you should know about.